So let me know when you want to get started. We could wait a few more minutes if you want, but
yeah, sure. We can give it a couple more minutes. It's nice to see a bunch of names. I'm gonna give a forewarning about the ghost that has taken over my laptop camera, so just bear with it.
I just have one quick question. Outside of the time that I'm presenting, I might, if it's okay, call in and listen to the other presentations just because I have to take my dogs out while I'm in the middle of this. So is that okay?
Totally. Of course,
Okay.
it's okay.
Great. I'll just give a preface when I'm going to call in. So awesome.
Okay.
Miigwech.
Thanks. I think that will work for people in the chat. Do people have access? Like, can you click on that document that I just shared in the chat, which will be the written portion of the submission towards the end of the webinar? Awesome. Thumbs up, I see. We'll continue to share that if people start to join, so that way it's accessible for everyone. And Alex, honestly, whenever
okay, cool.
we can get started.
I'll get going. So I'll introduce myself and then then you can introduce yourself, then we'll move on. So thank you everybody for joining today. My name is Alex McClelland and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University. And I'm working with the Tracking and Justice Project, and we're a law enforcement and criminal justice transparency project with people from the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice, with the Ethics and Technology Lab at Queen's University, with the Center for Research Innovation on Black Survivors of Homicide through the Factor Isherwak Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, with Justice Trans and Maggie's Toronto Sex Work Action Project, Women's Health and Women's Hands, and the Criminology Department at Ryerson University. And we're really pleased to have all of you here today. I'll just pass it over to Lindsay to introduce herself, and then I'll do an acknowledgement of the land after that.
Hi there. So great to see everyone. My name is Lindsay, and I am an associate of the Tracking and Justice project. Again, just a little forewarning. Computer is just being a little annoying at the moment. I am a person of lived experience who's been directly impacted by our bail system as well as our carceral system, experience of homelessness as well, and substance use. And honestly, I'm just really happy that we have the speakers that we have today and highlighting this issue around the proposed bail reform changes. I didn't want an opportunity to get past where we weren't able to submit our deputations and hear community's voice in this decision. So just thank you so much for everybody that's here today.
And thanks, Lindsay. And for those of you who don't know, Tracking and Justice recently released a report outlining the rise in deaths in custody across Ontario, with 41 people who died in custody in Ontario corrections since 2021, and that's almost double the number since the year 2000, or since 2020. Deaths in custody have been largely on the rise since 2015, and between 2010 and 2021, we know of 280 people who've died in Ontario custody. Personally, today, I'm coming to you from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa, and much respect to all of the land that everyone is coming to us from today. We view our commitment to prison abolition as related to the dismantling of the ongoing occupation and theft of these lands. And this acknowledgement strives to recognize the many nations and people who have used the lands and waterways of this region of Turtle Island over centuries and millennia. Indigenous knowledge, resistance, and self-determination not only make it possible for all of us to share this land today, but also mark the path forward out of colonization and dispossession. And we all know that policing and prisons and policing on these lands are a product of the colonial project that is known as Canada, where Indigenous ways of knowing, living, and remedying social problems were violently displaced for colonial rule using policing and prisons. And Canada's first prison, Kingston Penitentiary, was established by settlers more than 3 decades before Canadian Federation. As Bar Nunn Winnipeg notes, Kingston Penitentiary was designed to subject each of its prisoners to an environment so irksome and so terrible that during his afterlife, he may dread nothing so much as the repetition of the punishment. Ensuring that prisoners experience terror and dread until and beyond the grave. This was intended treatment for all those who didn't conform to colonial English law, mandated under the Consolidation Acts following Confederation in 1867. And so alongside the genocidal products of residential schools and the 60s scoop, policing and legal systems have been complicit in the disappearance and murder of Indigenous women and girls. And Indigenous people are disproportionately policed, receive less access to justice, and are over-incarcerated. Prisons are colonial injustice, no prison on stolen land, and land back, thank you. I'm gonna hand it over to Lindsay, who is going to introduce the rest of the panel, or the panel and the rest of today.
Thanks, Alex. Before we just jump into the roundtable of all the great speakers, just in response to the death of Tyree Nichols in the United States, I'd really like to take a moment right now to, one, have a moment of silence for Tyree Nichols, but also to acknowledge that deaths at the hands of police and death at the hands of our correctional system is happening within Canada as well. And so if we can all just take a moment of silence for that. Thank you. So, purpose of today is to hear from many different experts, frontline workers, people who have been directly impacted by our bail system. And so the reason for this is just this past week, there was, actually 2 weeks ago, there was a letter that was signed by every premier of every province across Canada wanting for proposed bail changes. This is in response to the 2 police officers that were shot and killed, and then the media divulging the entire criminal history of the persons that took the life of the police officers. I do want to acknowledge that, yes, it's a tragic incident all around. And that's not, the purpose is to dismiss the deaths of human beings in general. However, we have thousands of deaths in many different ways, from homelessness to criminalization of sex workers, to Indigenous folks, to Black folks, to incarcerated folks, and we don't see the same emergency response to change policies and to change the system, and it's really left up to community. And so with this letter, they've opened up public consultations and they didn't release it to the public in a timely fashion. And so police associations were able to fill up a lot of the in-person deputations. And so really that's why we wanted to put on this forum, is to give pump people full of information from many different intersectionalities of the bail system, and who it affects, and also to lead us through a written action so that we can all submit our own written deputation by Tuesday at 7 p.m., which basically just intercepts the power and the takeover of police associations being able to depute all this these proposed changes. I do want to say, and also if there's any lawyers that are listening right now, I'm not a legally well-versed person in how this actually impacts. But what I do know is that one of the proposed changes is this idea around reverse onus. And reverse onus is the presumption of innocence, presumption that basically if you get involved in the criminal justice system, that you are innocent until proven guilty. That's what it is right now. But with this proposed change of reverse onus is that you are guilty until you can prove yourself innocent or fit for bail. When coming up with like gun charges, gangs and guns, violent charges. And so that really does affect people's opportunity and livelihood of freedom. So I'm gonna stop speaking. Can someone please link the letter? Yep, we can link a letter, definitely, Aisha. But I would really like to get started because I'm more interested in what everybody else has to say. And so I'm gonna start off the roundtable with Angela. Angela is a warrior and a very resilient mother fighting for the justice of her son. And so Angela, please share your story with us. I know you're probably trying to unmute.
Was on my my computer actually wouldn't open it up this time. So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here and allowing me to speak about my son Jordan, drugs, overdoses, and incarceration. My journey to the light of understanding has taken me through some of the most terrifying trials and traumatizing moments. 1 second. I'm sorry, my dog is going crazy. 1 second.
That's totally fine. I think we all enjoy our pet interruptions, actually.
Yeah, he's a little crazy sometimes, but it seems only when I don't have, or he doesn't have my attention, right? So, although I would rather have learned through education, this is not how it happened for me. Lived experience in my past history has created me a foundation of understanding that we are all doing things the wrong way. Sadly, I also have learned a disrespect for authority, a learned anger, and how to be aggressive. These aren't typical behaviors for me, but the fire that burns inside my blood because of the stigma, that is real and makes me know every day that this needs to change. My son Jordan used drugs as a coping mechanism. So many failed attempts with psychiatrists, psychologists that would not listen and did not want to know or learn Jordan's lived experience. They denied him until he denied them. Then they just let him die because their skill set was so low that they couldn't figure out how to treat somebody with dignity and respect. The programs are written and the protocols are there. We have put so much money into developmentally disabled people who live on the systems their entire lives, most without any family. But yet mental health is a genetic disorder, and we treat people with depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, etc., like they are supposed to just exist, or even worse, be invisible. Our campaign says mental health matters, but our government has refused to give otherwise healthy people the same dignity and respect. I'm not saying that it's much better in group homes because these places are awful, but we do have a system, and it is a system that is proven to work. Could you just imagine if we put as much effort into mental health instead of incarceration. Medication and healthcare supports, homes, food, recreation, maybe even the Olympics, staff. We would end up with productive members of society that would give back to our society. Treating people negatively only gets a negative response. Naloxone in jails for incarcerated individuals to use. They seem to know more through lived experience. And it costs so much money for our government every time someone dies. So why not prevent it? I've proven it since Jordan passed away in 2020. I've helped more than 20 people realize their past decisions were never a lifetime sentence. With a home, work skills, food, and being part of something that they feel good about. Self-directed care, promoting independence, nonviolent crisis intervention. This, I admit, is not my favorite part, but we've all learned to cope with anger and respond to it. Because everyone feels like they are someone in my world. Because they are valued, they are important, and they are no longer disposable. I wish I had never asked for help and just brought Jordan home, because I can guarantee you that I would have done a much better job supervising him without all the fancy scanners, a PhD, RN, and an incompetent workers that failed. Without the lack of communication between departments, and without a second doctor that couldn't see past his arrogance and sent Jordan back to jail, dying. I most certainly would never have given somebody Gravol, especially when the person was clearly refusing the medication. They held him down and gave him an injection of Gravol that ultimately killed Jordan. There is no death sentence here in Canada, but I'll never see my son again. They say that Jordan's death is an accidental overdose, but there was no accidents in 2 failed scanners or somebody that gave him a lethal injection of Gravol. There is no accidents in these. These are no accidents, and these people should have a protocol. Oh, but they do have a protocol. They just ignored them, and they're still working. We know that traumatized individuals does not fix trauma. It only amplifies the hate and makes our society a dangerous place. Incarceration deaths have almost doubled from 2020 to 2021, but this trend has been rising since 2015. We have the skills, we have the protocols, they're just not in the right places for the people that needed them more than anyone. Incarceration is not going to fix itself. We need the influences of outside public organizations and agencies to educate and force accountability. So today I come to you with a broken heart, but a gift of knowledge and inspiring hope. These are the people we invest our lives into, our mothers, our fathers, our children, our brothers, our sisters, and our best friends. Mental health matters. So when do they matter? The ones who need it the most. Jordan's birthday is on Tuesday. He would have been 29, but he's forever 26 in an urn because I screamed for help. 2.5 days later, he was dead, and all I got back was a body bag and years of trauma. Justice for everybody.
Thank you, Angela. I also just want to highlight when Angela's talking about the 20 people that she's supporting, she's doing it on her own, supporting people that are on bail, and she is giving them places to live, giving them job opportunities, helping them with their trauma. And she's not affiliated to any organization. And so just kudos to you, Angela, for not just fighting for Jordan, but also for giving people second chances. who to avoid what you're going through. So thank you for that. I'd like to call on Justin Pichet now. Hey,
Hey there.
Justin.
Hey. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all of you on the call here for your work and everything that you're doing towards decarceral futures. I'm joining you from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, so-called Ottawa. I'll just briefly kind of go over a few points, but I don't want to take up too much space. For those who don't know, there has been a significant increase in pretrial detention over the last number of decades. And I'll just say that from 1986-87 to 96-97, on any given year, there were 23 to 30% of provincial territorial prisoners who were on pretrial detention, the others being in sentence custody. By 2000, 2001, 40% of those incarcerated by the provinces and territories were awaiting their trial. And then by 2004, 2005, over 50% of people in provincial territorial prisons were awaiting their day in court behind bars, and it's been that way ever since. Evidently, some jurisdictions imprison more folks on pre-trial detention than others. So-called Ontario is one of those that does imprison more people on pretrial. So right now, thanks to this wrong word to use, coroner's inquest that occurred this past summer into deaths in custody at the Lindsay Super Jail, we know that the province at that point was imprisoning 77% of people in provincial jails in Ontario awaiting their day in court. And so, unlike what police leaders and police associations are saying in terms of there being a bail issue and that we have too lenient of a system, the facts don't back that up. That's simply not the case. So putting that out there, massive rise in pretrial detention in this country and in jurisdictions like Ontario over the last number of decades. Second thing I just wanted to get into is that we know that it costs roughly $300 a day to imprison one person in a provincial jail here in this province. That's over $9,000 a month. That's close to $110,000 a year to imprison one person. Let's compare what you could do with less money and ask ourselves how that would improve community well-being and safety. Permanent supportive housing, $40,000 a year. Emergency housing, $25,000 a year. Rent supplements of $500 a month to help everyone make rent, $6,000 a year. Daycare, if we want to talk about earlier intervention, making sure that folks are experiencing the best possible childhood, $18,000 a year for daycare. Mentoring for youth, those programs are usually around $2,000. Leadership training, $875. Summer jobs for youth for 9 weeks at $20 an hour full time, $7,200 for a summer. Community gardens in the context of food insecurity, that's $12,000 a year per community garden. Harm reduction space, $14,500. Drug treatment for 35 days with a year of aftercare, that's $19,000. Counseling, $150 an hour. Peer support workers who have that lived expertise, who can offer care and compassion for those that need it, $52,000. And that's making $25 an hour full time. There's other things we could be doing here instead of trying to lock people up that could do a lot of good. I think one thing I'd also just briefly want to get into is that there's a lot of prisons that are being built right now across Canada, over $3 billion worth of new prisons, in fact. And, you know, one of the leaders, if not the leader in the country in building new prison spaces in terms of how much money they're allocating towards it is this province, Ontario. So, you know, they're just about complete $96 million expansions of the Kenora Jail on Treaty 3 territory, and the Thunder Bay Correctional Center situated on Robinson Superior Treaty territory that will add 50 beds to each of these carceral sites. And they're doing it to improve access to programming, I'm quoting them here, living conditions, and support the demand for increased access to literacy, skills development, and technology for safe community and great reintegration, health and safety for new hires, and providing a solution to overcrowding at both facilities. This is happening as a stopgap as the province embarks on building a new 345-bed Thunder Bay Correctional Complex, which is going to cost $1.2 billion over the life of a 30-year public-private partnership to design, build, finance, and maintain it. And again, it's rehabilitative rhetoric that's driving that prison. There's the Eastern Region strategy that's happening right now that includes a 235-bed proposed prison in Kentville that the Coalition Against the Proposed Prison, CAP Kentville, if you want to Google it up and check it out, is fighting to stop right now, which is going to be located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory if we don't stop it. And that's going to cost up to $499 million over the life of a 30-year mortgage, right? And they're also, as part of this Eastern Region strategy, wanting to replace the Brockville Jail with a Brockville Correctional Complex, and also expand the St. Lawrence Treatment and Correctional Center. And, you know, those projects together could cost up to $499 million, again, over the life of a 30-year public-private partnership. And, you know, that'll be located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And we're not done yet. They also want to build 48 beds for women at the Quinte Detention Center, which is located in Napanee, which again is on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And they're willing to spend up to $200 million for that. But so anyways, there's a lot of money being spent on cages, and we should be building communities, not cages. So I'll just leave that with all of you. One other thing that I've been working on that you may be interested in, and this was alluded to in the introduction for the event, in terms of like this moral panic that's currently happening. And, you know, you can get a sense of the moral panic when you look at the hashtags enough is enough, and other kinds of rhetoric that's out there. The police, when Constable Pershala got killed in late December, were saying that they were facing an unprecedented and growing wave of violence. And when you look at the figures, and I'll be releasing a report, or CPEP will be releasing a report later next week that will show what the actual data says. I'll just note that, you know, there were 405 on-duty police officers that have died in the last 60 years, for an average of 6.6 such deaths per year. There were 5 in 2022. You know, so there were 41 out of the 61 years we looked at. More officers died than last year. Most of those deaths, when they were the highest, were in the 1960s and the 1970s. And in fact, over the last decade, so 63 to 72, 92 officers died, 73 to 82, 92 officers died. Last decade, 2013 to 2022, 30. Okay. And one thing I'll just end on is that officer deaths resulting from intentional harmful acts, out of this 405 that we've identified, there were 168 that died from gunfire incidents, excluding, of course, the accidental shootings by their own colleagues. stabbings, assaults, and deliberate vehicle strikes. There was an average of 2.8 such deaths per year. So in contrast to 2022, where a total of 5 on-duty police officers died as a result of intentional harmful acts across the country, there were as many or more such deaths in 11 of the 61 years that we looked at. And just to say, these deaths, when we look at it over a longer period and decade over decade, it's been pretty stable for the last 30 years. And the highest amount of deliberate police officer deaths had occurred in the period between 1973 to 1982, which was 39, where the last decade, 2013 to 2022, was 20. So roughly half of that. So, when police officials and police association officials throw out their propaganda and claim that things have never been worse, people, everyday folks, the media really need to be asking them how they're substantiating those statements instead of just taking what they say at face value. We know that our analysis, it shows that police are putting forward this rhetoric despite the facts, and that really raises questions about what evidence they're basing their calls for more restrictive bail and harsher sentencing regimes, and whether or not those are evidence-based. I'd suggest they're not. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin. So much information there, and I think that's one reason why we're recording, and then I know some folks are just taking some notes as well. Like, I think it's super important that we keep counteracting this narrative and these false narratives that the media and police are putting out. And so, Justin, thank you so much for all that information, and also the breakdown of numbers for all the alternatives we could be spending the money in. It's so huge for us to even just have access to numbers like that. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to send it over to Tina Eldridge.
Hi, folks. My name is Tina, she, her. I am a social worker, community activist, retired sex worker. I live and work in the Toronto downtown east community, and I'm really happy to be here with all you folks. So thanks for having me. I was invited to talk about the criminalization of sex work, but I think I'd like to share a little bit about my experience with bail and the bail system, and how concerning it is for me about these new reforms that are being called for. So I was first arrested in 2007. It's the first time I've ever been arrested. It was a raid on my house, and there was a firearm and a really small amount of drugs found, some ammunition, and a bulletproof vest. So went to jail, had a bail hearing. I wanted to say I was coming from a place of poverty. I had been struggling with homelessness, my own history of drug use at the time. So my bail was denied. I didn't have a strong enough surety. I didn't have the support to get out. So 10 days later, I found myself in a courtroom pleading guilty to a 5-year federal sentence upon my first arrest. It later became an 8-year, 4-month, and 1-day sentence because when I was released on parole, I got convicted of a few new charges. When I first started talking to lawyers when I was incarcerated, I was in Vanier, and I was kind of told I was kind of shopping through different lawyers. I only had access to legal aid. So I was told that likely it would result in a conditional sentence because I'd never had any previous criminal charges or anything like that. But I really strongly believe that when you are held in custody and you're not given the ability to fight your case in the community, you're completely powerless. There's nothing you can do. You really have no choice. The evidence was there. I didn't want to go to trial because I was worried about what would happen if I did go to trial. So I pled to the sentence. And I think it's really, really concerning that this movement is towards keeping people in custody, because how can we fight against this? How can we build our cases? I could have if I was in the community, I could have reached out to a whole bunch of supports, done a whole bunch of programming, and probably avoided, maybe I wouldn't have gotten a conditional sentence, but I wouldn't have ended up with an 8-year prison sentence, right? And I think when you think about the impact of that too, Justin talked a little bit about the cost of it. So, to incarcerate one person in a female federal institution, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's close to $200,000 per year. So over $1 million was spent holding me in custody. And that doesn't even include the court costs, the police costs, the amount of police that were following me. When I saw my disclosure later, they had been following me, a team of them, for like 3 or 4 days. And yeah, it's just astronomical. I think the community at large doesn't know and understand how much of their dollars are being put towards locking people in cages, and how that then impacts the most marginalized people. And it just kind of is a whole further entrenchment of the school to prison pipeline. If you can't get out to build your case and do that, you know what I mean? You're just funneling people into prisons. So these bail reforms are extremely, extremely concerning. And I think when we talk about how it will impact people who do sex work, I think as in most, just the whole prison system in general, those folks who are most marginalized will have the deepest impacts. So Indigenous, Black, trans, people who do sex work outdoors, who use drugs, who struggle with mental health, they also have the highest rate of coming into contact due to the heavy targeted surveillance of police on them and their work and their actions outside. And Black sex workers have, highest incidence of being murdered by the police for just trying to make their living and do what they can to survive. So what will that look like for these folks if they have to produce reverse onus to be able to prove that they should be let out of prison with the stigma that they're already facing due to being labeled as sex workers, probably the mental health struggles they have, drug use, the lack of support, the lack of access to resources. Again, you're just punishing and funneling these folks into jails and prisons and leaving them no other choice but to plead guilty, even if they're not guilty. I think that's about all I had to say. I just wanted to also just touch on what Justin was saying about this idea of enough is enough. And I've really been thinking about in Toronto, the media play of the violence that we're seeing in TTC. And I highly suspect, and I don't have the numbers, but I highly suspect this isn't new. And it's not a rash of violence. It's not increased. I think it's just been underreported to create people's sense of safety. And now that we're trying to justify a $50 million increase to the police budget, media is playing this up in order to justify that and continue this rhetoric. That's all I had to say, folks. That is my rant. I'm excited to hear everybody else speak. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tina. I love the rant. Don't get to hear it very often, so it's wonderful. Thank you. And now I'm going to send it over to Lorraine.
Hey everyone, my name is Lorraine. I am currently an outreach worker in the downtown East Toronto area. I personally don't have lived experience of myself being incarcerated, but I've spent the last decade working with communities with people who are in and out of jail and trying to navigate this impossible system of prison and bail. And most of the people that I work with are unhoused or precariously housed, so that's where I'll be speaking from today. And I was thinking about this conversation around the criminalization of homeless people today. And I was thinking, how many of you have ever just been walking down the street, minding your own business, and then you're stopped by someone on the street who asks you for money? I have. And I didn't specify who, but for me, I was specifically thinking about the groups of people who wear the fancy uniforms and stand around with clipboards in the middle of the sidewalk, and they stop to ask me for money and my credit card information for a donation. But meanwhile, some people might have thought about the people who are poor and unhoused, maybe with mental health barriers, who stopped you and asked you for change. Both of those scenarios were people asking for money, taking up public space. But in one of those situations, those people are celebrated as charity workers, and they're like, yeah, take up all the space you need. And in the other scenario, those people are considered public nuisance. They're accused of loitering. They're asked to leave, and people often call the cops on them. And so when I think about this language of criminalization, I often think about the different standards that people are held to because of the bodies and the intersections that we hold. And I think we can't talk about criminalization without looking at things like race and gender and class, socioeconomic status, and things like that. Criminalization is rooted in intersectionality. And just by definition, it's the action of turning something, an activity, into a criminal offense because the law decides to make it illegal. And so in my observation around criminalizing homeless people, is that criminalization of homeless people is about how they're targeted and there's increased attention paid on them. They're surveilled for behaviors that people who are housed are not. It's about restricting what people who are unhoused can and cannot do. And there's like a discriminatory enforcement of certain laws. So here's an example. My friend Ryan used to panhandle around Yonge Street, Yonge and College in Toronto. And he often would be someone who would go up to people to ask for change. He was polite about it, but apparently that just made people feel uncomfortable. And one day, these business owners in the area, they called the cops on him. And the cops showed up, they asked him to leave. And meanwhile, across the street of Yonge, there was like actually like other charity people who were stopping people to ask for money. And so Ryan was like, well, how come you're stopping me, but not those people? Of course, the cops didn't give him a good reason and they wrote him a ticket for loitering. So Ryan was like, screw this. So he like threw the ticket on the ground. And then the cops wrote him a ticket for littering. And so then he took the ticket and threw it at the cops. And then they arrested him for an assault. Bananas. Another example, I was just this past week, I was in between appointments and I was sitting in the Eaton Center lobby on the ground, just on my phone on a meeting. And all the security that walked by just totally let me sit there. But you can imagine what happened when towards the end of my meeting, there was someone who looked a little bit more scruffy. He came in and sat down on the ground across from me. And immediately security asked him to leave. Criminalization is about different standards for people who are unhoused. Drinking in a park, how many of us have drank publicly in a park? But the number of unhoused people who get tickets for doing that, so many. So criminalization is about this discriminatory enforcement of laws, the surveillance. It's also about penalizing people for their lack of housing and for being poor instead of actually looking at root causes. So instead of the cops asking Ryan why he was asking for money, they defaulted to blaming him for his poverty and issued him a ticket that obviously he was never going to pay. Instead of addressing why people live in encampments, for example, they just evict people from them and arrest the people who are refusing to leave because they have nowhere else to go. When someone is publicly urinating in a public space, listen, nobody is out here thinking, man, I would love to pee in someone's backyard today. Nobody thinks that. And so instead of asking why someone isn't able to go to a washroom in the first place, or instead of asking why there's no public washrooms in the first place, the person is arrested for defecating in public property. But at the same time, how many of us have been in an entertainment district on a late Friday night and witnessed like drunk frat boys urinating on public property? And they're celebrated as boys will be boys, living the college life. And meanwhile, lots of people that I work with are tossed into the drunk tank overnight because they're unhoused. Criminalization of homeless people is also like the time when my friend Robert was arrested for stealing a block of cheese from Metro. He did 6 months of time for a block of cheese. And you know what he did when he got out? He went back to the same Metro and stole another block of cheese. Why are we not asking about why he had no money in the first place? Why was he hungry? He should not be going hungry. He was on welfare, so with $343 a month is hardly anything. What good would throwing him in jail do? Nothing. At the time, he actually insisted on continuing to put his case over because he had no warmer options. So for him, being in jail was the only warm and dry option that he had. That is wrong. The other example, when someone is arrested for being at a park after hours, they're being punished for not having housing. But why are there even hours to a public park? So criminalization of homeless people is about public space. It's about who the public is considered as public. It's making public spaces that are not actually public for unhoused people. So a really good example specifically in Toronto is that we've seen a lot of public benches disappear over the last number of years, or certain public benches in areas where people would congregate have sort of got these armrests on them now, so you can't actually lie down on them. Some of the new benches are sort of created with like metal slats so that they're just really uncomfortable. That's a way that public space is criminalizing unhoused people. There's no public bathrooms, or public bathrooms have to have a key code. That's another way of just making public space not public. And all of those different ways of criminalizing homeless people result in them becoming involved in the legal system. And so many people, I'm sure a lot of people here might know, like, once you're in the system, it just becomes this vortex of never being able to get out. And when you're inside, you lose your supports depending on how long you're in there for. So many people I've worked with have lost their housing when they're in there, and then they're discharged into homelessness. Like the number of times that I've had people show up in their jail shoes and their jumper in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, freezing without a winter coat. It's like way too many times. People are discharged from jail late at night and they only end up back in jail the next day because they were trying to find a way to survive and maybe broke a law. And the long-term effects of criminalization are then barriers to exiting homelessness because you can't find housing, you can't find employment, especially when they do like a criminal background record check. And since this conversation, we're focusing a little bit on bail, these new bail reforms, also weird, bail reforms I thought were supposed to be a good thing. So I'm really confused about this whole language, but here we are. So these new bail reforms means that people aren't able to get out. So for me, my first thought is, the number of people who I work with who are going to lose their housing because they can't get out, that is detrimental. The number of people who will plead to sentences just so they can get out is going to lead to long-term problems. This week I've been working with my friend Steven, who just got out recently. He was homeless and he still is homeless, but he was homeless because he was drinking to live, to cope. We did a few things that got him arrested and he was inside for a bit, and he was discharged onto the streets. He had nowhere to go, but eventually he managed to get a shelter spot, and now he's at a congregate setting where he sleeps in a dorm with 50 other men. His things keep getting stolen. He can't sleep, and his probation officer insists that he reports twice a week and says, why aren't you getting a job? And he got really angry the other day and said, Miss, I don't know how you think I'm supposed to get a job when I'm barely sleeping. I don't have a place where I can do job interviews, and you need me to report twice a week. What employer is going to give me 2 full days every single week for time off? And I can't just keep telling her my mom is sick. I have to be honest. So criminalization keeps people stuck in situations where they have no options. And it happens because our society labels these people, labels poor people, labels racialized people as, quote, dangerous. And we see these tropes fed to us through really terrible media reporting. I don't know if people have been watching some of the news in Toronto, specifically around the violence on transit, but the media reporting has been horrible around it. I have a couple of clips that maybe I can show, or I'll just link to it. But all of these myths are rooted in fear, and these propel stigmatizations and labels, and they feed this increasing tendency to criminalize homeless people. And I think what we're seeing around the narratives of public, quote, safety around public transit in Toronto in particular is a really important example. So there's this language around how things are so dangerous on public transit now. And there's a lot of unspoken things that imply that it's obviously unhoused people committing acts of violence. In fact, on January the 19th, I actually recorded it. So there was an incident of violence in the TTC, and this CEO of TTC went on Global News and said, what I need to combat this violence is I need more money for housing workers. He basically just implied that the people who were committing violence were unhoused and needed housing. That's the kind of rhetoric that feeds these kind of really dangerous narratives. Meanwhile, what we've seen in a number of cases of violence on TTC is that actually the people who perpetrated the violence were housed. And yet we're scapegoating people who are unhoused. We also know that with increased policing and surveillance, certain people are the ones who are going to be removed from transit, but where are they going to go? So by limiting the people who are unhoused, limiting their movement and their existence in public space, and not asking why they're there in the first place, these are all ways that we end up criminalizing unhoused people, especially on transit. And I think that we see criminalization of homelessness happen all around us, whether it's, in encampments or in the news, or even just in the larger government policies and narratives about whose safety is at risk. But I'd love for us to consider, whose safety are we talking about? Who's allowed to be in public? What is safety in the first place? Because for me, I think safety is about stability and accessing basic needs. And criminalization does not allow for this. And it actually results in a cycle that will never, ever improve root causes. I think we need to ask better questions around our systems. How are we okay that someone on welfare gets $343 a month to live? A few people have talked about the cost of legal proceedings, the cost of criminalization in court systems and legal proceedings and jail time. These are just like fiscally and financially irresponsible. A police officer is paid a minimum of $90 an hour. The people who are going to be patrolling transit will be paid overtime. Think about all of that money. It's cheaper for a person to have subsidized housing than to be in jail for a month. So to be in jail for a month, it's about $350 a day per inmate on average, and that's about $10,000 a month. Think about the basic resources that a person who's unhoused could have, the number of people that could be housed instead. And so I think in this conversation, as we think about bail and the jail conversation, I think we need to really emphasize and hear that like being homeless is not a criminal offense. It will not be solved by cuffs or cages and cops and incarceration. And we need to demand that things change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, and thank you for your commitment to the grind and the hustle and the promotion. And I also just, I really do want to highlight too, when we talk about criminalization of these different groups of individuals, we're talking about like increased police presence and surveillance of people, of police in these communities. And we know that police interactions, there is excessive force, and there are, when you get arrested, if you have experiences with the police from before, if you have trauma around any sort of violence, there is a response, your survival mode, you're defending yourself. But when you defend yourself of an arrest, then you get put that you were resisting arrest and possibly assault on a police officer. And when you have that assault on a police officer, if these so-called reforms are strictly being generated from this sense of honoring police officers, and because of the killings of the police officers, it really, for me, I see it's not just going to be people that are involved in guns and gangs. It's going to encompass a large amount of people that are not going to have access to get out of jail, strictly because of their own trauma, because of the experiences they've had with police in the past. But also, we know that police like to drop an excessive amount of charges on people at the beginning that you are then you have to fight to get removed, or to prove that the police are corrupt and that they're dropping all these charges. And so for us to fight the police when we're labeled the criminal at the time, it's really difficult. And then so I do just want to highlight that when we talk about that criminalization, it means way more police presence, surveillance, and possibility of excess charges. And so with that, I am going to pass it on to Louis March. And I think it's so great that you could join us today, Louis, because a lot of this push for reform is directly related to the work that you're doing within the community. And so I'm super happy to have you here because we don't get to have you in a lot of these spaces. So thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay, for inviting me. Thanks to the panelists, who is, every time I figure things out, I realize how much I haven't figured out, because there's always new information, new insights, new experiences that makes me further filled with anger and rage about this injustice in this justice system. Zero Gun Violence Movement is a network of over 40 different organizations, agencies, programs across the city that are working towards this very bold and ambitious objective of zero gun violence in our city. An objective that many people think is impossible. And Zero Gun Violence Movement's position is clear. We already have zero gun violence in our city, but it's only in certain postal codes for certain people. So if you can have zero gun violence in Rosedale, why can't we have it in Rexdale? So don't tell me that we're asking for the impossible. We're just asking that the status quo not be accepted anymore. Our work centers mostly on, I'm the founder of Zero Gun Violence Movement, and we started 2013, summer, as a 90-day summer initiative to deal with the gun violence issue. And 10 years later, we're still at it. Because as we peel away the layers, we find out more and more. Our objective, our mandate is simple. We're all volunteers. working towards this objective. It's about the education and awareness about gun violence in our city. Noting clearly that the narrative from the politicians and the narrative from the police is as far away from the truth as it could be. How do we tell the true story? As my mentor said to me many years ago, nobody's born with a gun in their hand. No one's born saying that they want to be a gang leader, a drug dealer, or whatever. If you really want to solve this problem of gun violence, understand the pathway, the trajectory. How did it happen? Instead of focusing always on punishment. So how do we fill in the gaps by talking about gun violence from a different perspective? Our second piece is advocacy. How do we advocate for change in government policy, funding, priorities, and so on? So yeah, so we have been to Ottawa, we've been to provincial government and municipal governments, and we've spoken clearly about what needs to be done. And the third piece is engagement, and this is where the bail reform comes in. Engagement, who do we engage? We work with mothers who have lost children to gun violence, and we also work with those people involved in creating the violence. People who have done the crime, done the time, and want to make a difference. So our perspective on this, solving the gun violence problem comes from a different perspective. The people that caused it, the people that are victims of it, and the many people and organizations across the city that want to do something about it. So in dealing with the population that is responsible for the violence, we have to understand, how did it happen? How did we get to that point? And a lot of people are not asking that question. I've been working in the community with young people for over 40 years. Police racial profiling is something that we've spoken about for 40 years. 2 years, last year it was, where the chief of police in Toronto came out and said, yes, we've done some research now and we realize that racial profiling does exist in the police force. 40 years we've spoken about it. In addition to that, we see the justice system. I think Lorraine spoke about the criminalization. I'm going to talk about the criminalization of Black peoples and other peoples too. When we look at the justice system, we must understand that is a three-legged system. Policing, the courts, and corrections. The three of them work together. The entrance point into the justice system is through the police. The over-surveillance of certain communities, the overcharging of certain peoples, the strict bail conditions imposed on certain people, and also the access to representation in the court system. And these are the challenges that we see. When we talk about bail reform, we know that over 90% of the people comply. And the ones that do not comply are generally ones they didn't show up in court. Or so there's a public panic now because the 2 police officers that got shot. And that public panic is a result of a dominant narrative orchestrated by politicians and police. Where is the counter narrative? When is the real narrative? When we speak to people that are on bail and we provide mentoring supports to people who are on bail. So again, our perspective on does it work or does it not work is going to be different. We have a problem. We have a major problem here in that, let's think of a funnel. For Black people and the over surveillance, the laying of charges, the multiple charges is huge. So that's the beginning of the funnel. And at the bottom of the funnel, there's limited ways out of this justice system. So with racial profiling, carding, targeting vulnerable people in these communities, the intake is tremendous. And not only that, the multiple and excessive charges, when the police who have the authority to lay the charge decide on which charges will be laid with which people and which people will not be charged. So massive intake into this justice system. And as I said, the bottom of the funnel, limited ways out. Flip the funnel around. Flip the funnel upside down. For other people, and this is the criminalization and the different standards. Who lays the charges? What charges? How many charges? For other people, there's limited access points into the system due to privilege, race, so on and so on and so on. But there's multiple ways out. Flip the funnel upside down. So this is what we're dealing with. Massive sweeps in our community for targeted populations. Indigenous people, homeless people, Black people, and so on, and access points out. And then we talk now about the justice system. The bail conditions that are set are dependent on the quantity of charges. So if the police is going to lay 10 charges when they know that 1 or 2 might make it in court, the justice or the JP has to make the bail conditions reflective of those 10 charges. There's a ladder effect, right? How many charges, all this takes place. And then the bail conditions are going to be such that it's unbearable at times. You can't be human anymore. So we have this problem here. Racial profiling, the massive sweeps, the funnel, right? Targeted populations that we're going to put into the justice system. And then we're not going to give them the quality representation that other people have. Then the justice system sets the bail conditions. As I said, over 90%, I think there was 2 summers ago, maybe 3 summers ago, there was something where the police were going to do checks to see how many people were complying with the bail conditions. It was a summer initiative in Toronto. I think they did about over 1,000 checks, and 97% of the people were complying. Do we need bail reform? Are we saying that because 3%, 4% are not complying for whatever reason, the whole system, and because those 2 police officers got shot, now the narrative, the dominant narrative has switched, has changed. There's a public panic. I've never seen all premiers write one letter to the Prime Minister of Canada in agreement on anything. I've never seen that before. So what is it about bail reform that everybody can agree with? All these premiers, not only the premiers, our illustrious, I call him the city emperor, is behind. I think he goes by the name mayor, but we call him emperor these days, right? I've never seen them all agree on anything before. So now we have this. Created a public panic, influenced directly by the media, and right now, a discussion being taken. The government doesn't work this fast. So what is going on here? What is going on here? So in order to get bail, the defense, the counsel, and the justice have to agree. Is this person a threat to public safety? Should we incarcerate? or should we set bail conditions? The three of them agree. However, that bail condition is dependent on the quality of representative of the defense, which is mostly like bottom of the barrel, sorry. Okay. Legal aid, it's just a matter of numbers. Just plea, let's go with this and so on and so on. This population will never get the quality representation at these bail hearings that other people get. Sometimes we shake our head and say, really? This is what happened? I spoke to one person today. 2 years so far that he's got on house arrest, 1.5 years. His court date is not until next year. He's got 2 children, and he's got the strictest of strict bail conditions. How do we keep him sane for this period of time when he can't even go to a relative's funeral? What do you think is likely to happen? As many of my brothers and sisters will say, the system is working the way it was designed. We need to target a certain population, arrest them, incarcerate them, and if necessary, throw the key away. And now you're talking about bail reform with total approval and agreement by all the premiers and mayors and police chiefs, because what has been described here today is the over-reporting, the public panic due to these stakeholders. Let's call them stakeholders. And what is the counter narrative? And that's why this forum is important. We need to have an honest discussion about what's really taking place, whose lives are being threatened, which systems are being reinforced, and how do we get a seat at the table to make our voice heard. So I'm happy to be here, but I'm also saddened by the fact that we have to do this. But it's just a true indication of how the system was designed, how it's operating, and is it really fulfilling its purpose? Yes, it is. So Zero Gun Violence movement is about challenging the narratives out there, inserting narratives that are seldom heard, seeking justice, not only for some people, but for all, but also about zero gun violence in our city, not only for certain communities and certain people, but for all. So whether it's housing, whether it's drugs, whether it's policing, all these things come into play. We have to let our voice heard. They know that the people that are involved in criminal activity will not speak up. We have to find a way to get that voice to the table without threatening this population. They all have a right for equal justice. They all have a right for timely justice. And incarceration is not the only tool that they have. There's something called humanity. There's something called caring that we have to bring to the table. So with all these people at the table today, I'm anxious to hear everybody's voices, because as I said, when I figured things out, I realized how much I haven't figured out, because there's so much layers to this, but we have to start somewhere. So again, Lindsay, thanks for inviting me. I'm just hoping that I can add some value to the discussions today, and as we move this thing forward. Too much is at stake if our voice is not heard. Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to the panelists.
Louis, your voice is heard, and it is important to be here. This issue directly affects the people that you work with, and so no, just thank you. I also think it's just really, I can give you a quick example how fast, Louis saying how fast this thing moves, that we don't see how fast government moves unless it's something like this. And I'm supporting a really, really good friend of mine who currently is on charges for gun charges. And the Crown has already introduced this letter within court. Like, this isn't even done yet. Like, this is just a consultation, and Crowns are already taking this letter signed by every province and submitting it into court. So you're already creating that narrative within court, and nothing is finalized or legalized. And so I just think it goes way deeper than just what we're reading. You know, it's already implementing our court system, which is automatically going to start detaining more people. What I'm going to do too now is just send it over to Brianna Olson.
Anin, everyone. My name is Brianna Olson Pitawanaquit. I'm a member of Wakamacong Unceded First Nation. I'm someone with a lived experience. I currently reside here in Toronto and am on my traditional territory, but I also resided in a place called the Miskochi, Waskahegan, or Edmonton, Alberta for many years, and that's where a lot of my experience comes from. I am a harm reduction worker, and I do a lot of organizing in the community, so I'll also speak from that perspective as well. So my interactions with the legal system or the criminal justice system began even before my own lifetime. My own grandmother and my mother were stolen and taken forcibly into the residential school and Indian day school system. And many of my family members within our community were criminalized by the law enforcement that was present there. The OPP in the 1960s were kicked out of our community and not allowed to return because of the brutal violence that they were inflicting on Indigenous men and family members. And that's a legacy that you know, has informed my own life in many ways as an Indigenous person, as a Anishinaabeg person. So I'll just start with my own personal experience. I was criminalized at a very young age. At the age of 13 is when I first had my interactions with the criminal justice system, police, and the courts. And it was, a lot of it was based around my own intergenerational trauma as a survivor and coming from a lot of violence and abuse within my own life, but also the legacy that is the residential schools have created within this country. It was around that time that I was also a victim of exploitation. So I was facing quite serious sexual abuse from very older men within the community. And, you know, that was something that also translated to abuse at the hand. Oh, that was super loud. I don't know what that was. Abuse at the hands of police. It was throughout that journey of abuse and violence that the rage within me began to build and build. And as many survivors know, that is a huge way that we are able to channel the powerlessness and that we feel. So I often think back to that young 13-year-old self, and a huge facet of that also was to medicate with substances. So became a very, very heavy drug user at quite a young age. The only thing that was able to change that trajectory in my life were two things: ceremony and harm reduction. And that's why today I'm a huge proponent of both of those things within my community. And, you know, looking back at my situation and the situation of many of the young people and young women and Two-Spirit folks within my community is that the inevitable outcome of all of this was incarceration, was involvement, was prosecution. And it really speaks to a larger issue right now within this country. It's an international human rights crisis, is the overrepresentation of women, Indigenous women within the carceral systems, and something that was very much like a reality from, oh, I don't know what that is, but it's super loud and it's hurting my ears. So vast majority of the folks that I grew up with ended up incarcerated long-term. Many died from overdose, and many continue to struggle within those systems. And, you know, we look at some of the treatment that I received at that time. So things like, you know, the what I call the tradition within this country is the over criminalizing and the under support of Indigenous women as victims. So, you know, for example, being found within a trap house with 40-plus-year-old guys when I was 13 and having none of the police officers report any of it to my mother, and having only any of the interventions being where I was myself looked at as the criminal. And you know, being abused in police custody, having like, what do you call it, pliers held to my face, like these kind of things were very common and normal for all of my peer group. And we're talking about, I'm not talking about me as an adult, I'm talking about me as like a young child, essentially. So this is very common, and people, you know, it's verbatim, it's very rarely talked about within systems, is the abuse that police perpetuate against Indigenous people within these systems. So things like being beaten with phone books so that you don't have any bruises, you know, I was taken on my first Starlight tour when I was 16.
Hello, everyone.
And instead of being driven to the edge of town and let out, I was driven around for 6 hours within the back of a police vehicle, in the back of a police van with 6 other people in plus 35-degree weather with no air conditioning. So those are the kind of treatments that Indigenous people face within these systems, and that translates again into the jails where they end up inevitably. So again, like juvenile detention to, and just like that continual cycle of being in those systems and then, you know, graduating into the adult systems, which was a reality for so many of my peers. What we see oftentimes is that people will face pretrial detention, that their non-racialized peers will be let out of those systems on bail, but oftentimes Indigenous people are viewed as higher risk, and for many structural reasons that we know because of colonization, and will never be let out during pre-trial detention. So we'll sit in jail for, you know, years, my God, even up to 2 years waiting for trial. Lack of appropriate representation, so having like subpar or lawyers that like actually just won't even show up. So then you're having to wait like months at a time to even get your next appearance in front of a judge. I actually went on to work my first job was in a criminal defense office. So I know, I worked within that system for many years before I moved here to Toronto. And then again, people, you know, we acted as surety for so many people, and realizing that in cases where that we weren't able to do that, impoverished family members were asked to make cash bail, and then inevitably the person would be sent back to prison, and then that money would be absorbed by the system. So really just like a cash cow on the part of the system to be stealing, essentially, from, in my opinion, that money from already impoverished family and community members. The really messed up part is that even after I was able to, you know, turn my life around and become somebody that advocated for the community, my interactions with these systems did not end. I was illegally searched and detained by police. I was surveillanced for my activism around missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and girls. I had to report serious incidents within my community where I would be a witness to police brutality and violence. I had my now deceased father within a trap house being exploited, and the police refused to act and simply just watched and wouldn't engage because they looked at it as like a place of bait. And my father ended up dying very tragically shortly after that. Showing up at my house, pushing for statements to be written, and calling my boss when I would engage in activism within my community. And this is just a small snapshot that even after I was out of that carceral system, these are the kind of things that followed me as an Indigenous woman within my community, even though I was quote unquote like contributing member of society. And what we see so often, and I think Lindsay alluded to it, is that for so many of my peers, it was just a constant cycle of trauma, of being like myself, violated, being a victim of abuse by these systems, by the carceral system, by the police, by the court system, by all of these different places where you actually are completely powerless, and being so traumatized because you're being beaten up by security guards, because you're being strip searched and abused by police, and then just that accumulative trauma that Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people are facing, and it creates these, like you're just so traumatized in these systems, and your responses are, totally adaptive to you, but the system again views that as more another reason to punish you. So that accumulative trauma is something that I see with so many Indigenous women that are now incarcerated for years and years. What I have seen is that people, friends of mine, so I'll speak about one friend in particular who had no history of violent charges, was a heavy drug user for many years. Never once, any of their charges were only around property crime, theft, and they talked on end about, they got considered a prolific offender, and talked on end about the police hunting them. It got to the point where they did something, got like a weapon to defend themselves, and not even a day later were shot 9 times by the police within Edmonton. So looking at that violence from the system actually perpetuating what, violent crime by people, but actually it's people defending themselves, because we know behind the scenes that things are much more stark and much more violent than what we are ever shown in the media or talked about in the news. And then another, yet last year, the first death within custody in the country was a friend of mine who I was in theater school with. We were in theater school. He was a Afro-Indigenous man who was an actor and just a brilliant person. And again, for all of those reasons, ended up within those systems and was murdered within jails, realizing that he never really had a chance. Like there just was never a chance for him to find a solid space when he came out, that he was just, again, a drug user, and was just sentenced to go in the system again and again. And the vast majority of the time when I was working, and I'm still working here in Toronto with supporting people that come out of the prison systems, is people are just simply put back in for using drugs. And that is 99% of the time the reason. It is absolutely atrocious. Drug use is a health issue. People need access to health care. They need access to safe supply. They need access to safe, tools to use drugs with, but are consistently just sent back to prison. And that is something that we do now with Native Art Society. So it's an arts program through TIER where we support people who come out of prison to do art and sell their art. They get all of the proceeds. They can, make an income from their art. And my gosh, we actually support people who do art in prison because they just are out for a week and then they go back in, and it's 100% of the time because of drug use. They're criminalized for using drugs, and it's just such a human rights issue and such a dark stain on the system in this country. And so I think that's about it. I think I'll leave it there. I said a lot, and I do firmly believe that there's a crisis in this country that is only getting worse. And that, again, I just agree and want to affirm what every single person here said about the propaganda that's going on right now. That is absolutely just ridiculous. And that we are really lucky to have people in the community who have lived experience, who are supports, who are advocates that can speak truth to power and actually illuminate some of these the realities within these systems. So maybe I
Bree, thank you so much. And just thank you for sharing. You know, I do just want to add, when you mentioned that people get hunted by the police, most recently Keep Six, who's an organization here in Toronto, and they work with folks that are Black folks that are criminalized. They just did a webinar this week with a gentleman who is currently in Collins Bay. And I'll put the link in the chat, but this gentleman was given bail on serious charges for the intent of the police to continue to hunt him and build cases and to frame him for other crimes that were committed. And so even just like the power that the courts and what Louis said, it's the police, the courts, and the correctional system. We had all three systems working together to continuously let this person out who was on gun charges on bail after bail after bail after bail, with the main purpose of creating their case, right? And so I think it's also just really important to understand that this reform is also just based on their intention and their motives, hitting their quotas, and as Louis said, creating this big funnel of people for people to enter the system but no way to get out. And so yeah, thank you. It is 2:30. We have one more speaker, and then we are going to move to the action part. We'll just go through the written template of the deputation. We'll show you where to submit the deputation, and just to hear why it's really important that we get our voices in there. So last but not least, Aisha, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you so much, folks, for organizing. For everyone who spoke before, and for your powerful testimonies. It is truly heartbreaking to hear the damage of the ongoing war, settler colonial and civilizational war on people, the war that, you know, treat other people as disposable, some people as disposable, based on certain actions that they engaged in, not taking into account the systemic reasons why some people might engage in certain actions, and also just the policing of certain groups of people based on what the carceral system deemed to be acceptable, you know, deemed to be safe, you know. So we're talking about people who are incarcerated that are caged for a lot of reasons. People go to jail for a lot of reasons, you know, and I have a lot of friends that are there right now for big and small things, you know. I know people who are there for shoplifting and for other petty things for months. You know, people spend 8-9 months behind bars. Folks who use drugs are being locked up now because of fentanyl and other reasons, to like these big sentences. Someone spent 18 months behind bars just because she was found guilty of trafficking fentanyl, and it was only like a 0.2 of fentanyl, like 0.2 grams of fentanyl, you know. And it's
anyway, yeah.
Sorry. Oh no. Yeah, it's just like very violent what happens to people inside, and even by the Justice Department's own words, spending time behind bars increases one's likelihood to engage in criminalized activities in the future. And like our friend Louis said, that, you know, we're not born with a gun, you know. But not only that, we're not born with the gun. We're not only the people who make billions of dollars from that industry, you know, that is killing people in our neighborhood. When you go to our neighborhoods, a lot of my friends either died, got killed, or are in jail, lingering there for long periods of time. Myself, I spent a long time in jail, not as long as some people, but I spent a little while in jail. And when I used to go in, I used to go for bail hearings. And because I was found guilty of breaches, because they put some conditions on you that you are going to breach regardless, because it's a trap. They set you up for failure. And because of my breaches, I could not get bail on some charges. When I used to be at OCDC, I used to ask people, like pretty much like a lot of people, a big portion of people who are at OCDC are there because of breaches that happen while they are in community. And breaches is another way that the so-called justice system, but the injustice system, keeps people behind bars, you know, and increase their perception of the person's likelihood of not respecting conditions that are imposed by the courts. But why would we respect conditions that are imposed by the courts while these conditions sometimes wrench us from our very communities? A lot of people get released on red zones, you know, they're not able to access certain spaces that are vital to them, that they depend on those spaces for their survival. But the police will arrest you, then red zone you, then you're not able to access that. Or in my case, give me bail, but not allow me to live with my partner at that time who was pregnant, force me to be on almost house arrest at my mom's house, even though I moved out of my mom's house for a long time. And I was lucky to have a surety, because a lot of people don't even have a surety. That's why these like nonprofits, you know, that's one thing that they provide is bail and sureties to bail people out of jail. But we're going to be quite frank, like they are also part of the problem rather than the solution, because bail is another way that surveillance is, is expanded into our communities, where these sureties become your jailers, and they become like the people who are enforcing, these settler colonial governments' conditions and laws. So it creates a lot of tension between people. A lot of people get into fights with their sureties. A lot of people, the relationships with their sureties become tainted. And a lot of times, sureties abuse people who were released from custody because, you're in a situation that your surety can call on you at any time and put you back in jail. So people, they use that sense of power that they have over other people, that the state gives them over people's freedom and life. And they use that to, straight up abuse people, get like favors from them in all kind of ways, make them do some labor for them. It's just a bad system. We know that prisons do not solve our problems, but people are still relying on them. But I think the issue is wider than just the prison, because it is a tool that is linked to other systems beyond it that are a lot of times local, but often also global. And I think with these new prisons being built, these laws that they're trying to pass, we see how disabled people have been, life has been disposed of even more as of late with the global pandemic raging. I feel like it's an intensification of like carceral powers that it's gonna take a big fight to bring them to their knees because of all the tools and the extent of the power that they have and stuff. But in terms of police officers being killed, you know, I truly am gonna be honest, I don't really care if there's police officers who are being killed. They are waging a war on us that is already killing a lot of us and destroying a lot of life in the land and the water and everything. So if they are going to wage a war on people, they have to expect some casualties, but of course now they want to protect themselves. And I looked at the letter while some folks were speaking very briefly, and this idea of like reverse onus is already happening, you know, like people who are criminalized, we know that we are not innocent until proven guilty. These are mere lip service and like good words that they use in the law to like veil the very entrenched, you know, violence that they reap against criminalized people. So we already know that people in jail, they already tell you like, yo, we already guilty until found innocent, you know, especially Black, Indigenous folks and other racialized folks and stuff. So their words, their laws, even if they change them, is not gonna change much. We need to uproot this whole system and trying to deal with each other in different ways. And another quick point that I want to make too about certain nonprofits and the increase of surveillance into our communities. Like, yes, people are outside, they are granted bail, but they have ankle monitors and like, you know, like machines that they have to blow into for alcohol or other surveillance technology that is used against people. Now they even have like a couple people that I know who was released. They have this app on their phone that the police can check on them anytime because they're on house arrest. So basically you are you're like just hanging out, chilling, your phone is there, and all of a sudden the police are watching you and talking to you to do like a check-in, you know. This is ridiculous. And it's not like this surveillance is not already happening, because they are surveilling some people already like that. You know, they're putting cameras in people's homes. They are entrapping people in different ways because they are surviving and trying to survive under capitalism in this messed up society. And yeah, like the surety problem, like I said earlier, is a big issue with the bail system. The whole system is a trap meant to keep some people in cages. And I hope that more people, you know, rise up to these folks in like these systems as well, in serious ways, and, you know, challenge them to the core and put their privilege on the line in serious ways, because criminalized people, you know, are already doing that on a regular basis, on a daily basis. You know, we're talking about like, you know, creating the worlds we live in. Criminalized people are already engaging with each other outside of the system, outside of a lot of systems that a lot of people are still, you know, embedded in, you know. And yeah, we do that on a daily basis. We take care of each other. We show up for each other. People have a lot of issues in our communities. And even, you know, with like some like messed up stuff that happens, we see that people are able to like transform themselves and heal from some of the violence and harm that they can cause, but they're not afforded humanity. So we just need to treat each other with more understanding and create systems and fight the ones that don't allow us to do so. Create systems that sustain life rather than, you know, lead us to our I don't know, like imminent extinction, like, you know, just yeah. So thank you. I'm gonna leave it at that. And I wanted to speak about many more things, but I know we're running out of time. So thank you folks for having me. And I hope everyone has a good day.
Aisha, thank you so much. And just really what you said at the end to our imminent extinction. I mean, it's pretty much that. I do want to follow up with a quote from somebody who's currently incarcerated who wasn't able to call in, and it just so happens like the quote is really supportive, Aisha, of everything you just said. And he said that bail is not easy, and it's not what people think. It's a false sense of freedom. It's a tight leash. If I was to define bail, it's a false sense of freedom and a trap. They set you up to fail or make it really hard on you. And I think, again, we need to get that narrative out that the courts and these systems are doing us a favor by letting us out on bail, right? Like it's not that case, and we need to, more people need to understand how difficult bail can be. And even with these reforms, if they perceive it as letting you out as a favor, the conditions that you have attached to you make it extremely hard to move and navigate through the system and to be this so-called productive member of society. I really want to thank you so much for all the speakers. It's so great to have you in this space, and I think that this conversation is long overdue. And so I just definitely want to take the last 15 minutes. I'm going to throw it over to Alex, and maybe we have Emily Coyle that's here as well that can maybe just give us some insight on why it's important for us to do the written deputation, because none of us have time to do it in person because of the really crappy call out, and also just yeah, lead us through the activity. So maybe Emily, can I just send it to you for a quick few words around why deputations are so important and who you are, and yeah, just at that.
Hi, everyone. So thanks to Lindsay for inviting me to come today and to hear all of your powerful words. My name is Emily Coyle. I work at the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. And I think actually everything that everybody said that I heard is the reason why there needs to be deputations that go in person on Tuesday and Wednesday, so that this sham, and I will say it's a bit of a sham, it's a grandstanding on the part of the provincial government of Ontario, because there's the idea that bail reform can happen at the provincial level, which it really can't. And so what they're doing is putting into this soup that we all wade in, they're adding ingredients that are untrue. And so they're adding to the narrative pieces that don't actually change anything around the laws of bail. And what we do need is bail reform when it comes to people being let out of prison, particularly people who are serving time when they haven't been charged, or sorry, when they haven't been convicted of any crime. So certainly we do need bail reform, but it's not the kind of bail reform that they're asking for. And when it came to our attention that this consultation was happening, the understanding that I had was that it was mostly police officers who were being given the platform. And so it's really important that we have a balancing of the narratives that are going forward. And so I took a look at your wonderful template. I think it's fabulous, and I'll throw it back to you, because the more people who are able to add to that narrative that counters the dominant narrative around why we need bail reform that's being promoted by our premier and the rest of the premiers in Canada, the better. So thank you so much again. Thanks to everyone for your powerful words. Those are the reasons why we need people to go and speak out.
Thanks so much, Emily, for that. So what I was going to do is quickly walk people through how they can make their submission. And Lindsay has put together a really helpful template that can do that. Everything of all the powerful words that were spoken today could be, and I know some of you are reading, could be used as a submission. A couple of the things to note. Well, first of all, in the submissions, any submission that you do make it ends up being part of a public record, so it can be publicly accessible. So just make sure that you're aware that if you do make a submission and you include specific details about your life, that submission will be on the public record and people will be able to publicly access it. I'll walk people through how to make the submission. It's pretty straightforward, but just so that you can see that, and then we can walk people through the template as well. But to submit your submission, you can submit it online. And if people have questions, Lydia, you have a question?
Hey, Alex, sorry to interrupt.
No,
I
go
just
for it.
wanted to let folks know I spoke with my MPP, and if people do want to make submissions that are relating to their own personal experiences and don't want to have those experiences on the Hansard record, there is a way to do that. And you would do it through your MPP, because I know for me, there's stuff I wanted to talk about that I don't want on a public record. And so there is a process for that, but it's external to this right here, just in case people are thinking
That's
about
really
it.
awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So then you directly contact your MPP and you can submit information that way. That makes so much sense. But you go to this website, the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. You click that you want to be submit in relation to this specific study, and then you go here if the website moves, and we can't submit applications to appear in person anymore. That deadline's passed, but you can submit written materials. So you click this and this. And when you, I'll just tell you how you should format your material in a second. There also is guidelines here, but, and then you can submit your material either as an individual, or if you are submitting on behalf of an organization, you can do that. And you just include either the information about your organization and individual, and then you can upload as many pages as you want within this 20 megabyte limit. And they ask that, maybe I can show this to you as well. They ask that submissions are brief, but of course include as much information as you want. And we want everyone's stories to be told and experiences to be told. And along with experiences, they want a summary of a suggestion around recommendations. And then they ask for this format. You don't have to submit in this format. You can also submit a handwritten submission, and you can submit submissions in other formats as well. But if you want people to read them and look at them and take them seriously, it probably is helpful to follow the submission guidelines here, which are pretty straightforward. And then Lindsay has put together this really awesome and helpful guide on how to submit and how to create a template, or it is a template for how to submit. And the submissions are due by this deadline. We weren't given a lot of time in this, and as Emily noted, it is political theater, but we can play that game too. And so encourage everyone to submit their experiences and stories and share this widely so that we can share the balance with the many police who will be presenting and sharing their experiences on this. And so Lindsay has suggested some really clear questions about people's experience. It's really important to be factual, specific, and include recommendations. So not just experience, but include some recommendations about what you think could change. That's what they're going to be looking for. And you don't also want to have other people conclude with certain recommendations that you don't agree with. So providing clear, concrete recommendations is really a solid way forward. Lindsay, did you have anything else to add around that?
No, this is helpful for me too. I've never done this before, so this is great.
You can write these from your own experience, just about what happened to you from your own lived experience. That's really taken seriously and is a great way to do a deputation. You can also write from the experience of your organization. If you have backup information or appendices to add, like any reports or anything, you can add those as well. Take all the space that you can and take up space when you send these. And share as much specific details as possible. And so Lindsay has suggested you include, which I think this is a great template, and just include an introduction about who you are, why you're submitting this submission, what the issue is, the specific incidents or experiences. And many people shared about the multi-layered and many different experiences that happen to people and have happened to all of you. And And so it's hard to condense those down, but if you can think of specific ones to include that would be illustrative to help with recommendations, that would be really awesome. And then conclude with some specific recommendations, what you're actually asking for about, and how that can intervene specifically in this idea of reverse onus would be pretty awesome. I noticed there is a question. We'll just send, we put the template in the chat, we'll just do it again. And we can also email it out to people if they send us their email, but I'll just put it in the chat now again for you. And I think that's all on my end in terms of how to submit. In the template itself, we have the link to where to submit so that you can do that, and you have until Tuesday to do that. So the more that we can get in, the better. And I'll hand it back to Lindsay for any kind of final words, or if there's any questions or clarifications, let me know.
Yeah, I do definitely, like, if there's any questions about this deputation, we could take it right now. Yeah, we really just wanted to make it as easy as possible. I know for myself, I just want to thank everybody that showed up. I want to thank everybody who shared. I think that there needs to be more conversations like this that show and highlight all the intersectionalities, and to show how the three systems really affect so many people. And hopefully, like, this can just keep building our numbers together and start working together, because ultimately it's really important we intercept this power and intercept the continued silence around police, as well as like deaths in custody, death by police. And so I'm just so grateful for everybody that took the time today to share. And yeah, Louis, go ahead.
Yeah. Personally, it hurts to sit down and listen to this, because it didn't have to be this way. The dominant narrative have run things for far too long, and there's so many other voices that have not been heard. So I'm just thankful, and Lindsay, Alex, and the panelists, I just wanted to just say thank you for doing this. There's so many voices. And there's so many voices out there and experiences that are seldom heard. And it's painful to listen to the police chiefs, the premier, the emperor, and the media control this narrative. And it's sad to say that decisions are made on these narratives if we continue to remain silent. So Lindsay, Alex, everybody else, thank you very much for doing this. And I'm hoping that it inspires, motivates, encourages people to stand up and let their voice be heard. We can do better. So I just want to say that.
I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you, Louis, very much. And I just want to say thank you to everybody here that is still fighting the fight and who work directly frontline and have to carry so much on a daily basis while still fighting the silence. So thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.